Yeah, yes, indeed. I mean, I think all of that certainly is playing out and will play out in the coming days, weeks, months, dare I say, years. Scott, I wanted to transition quickly to maybe a couple more stories. One, of course, is what's happening in Gaza. So Israel is on the assault, on the offensive, you could say, as they have been for many months now. This time targeting Rafah. So during the Super Bowl, many folks were talking about interesting X had trending Patrick Mahomes, the quarterback, and at the same time, more people were tweeting about Rafa, but Mahomes was trending first. So shows a little bit of a bias there. But this has been going on an intensified bombing campaign. There is talks about a ground operation of Rafah, this small village packed like Palestinians are packed like sardines here because they've been displaced from every other area, bombed all along the route to Rafah, now being bombed in Rafah. Many have been killed. The numbers, I think, are an undercount likely coming out of the pages of the New York Times. But you have William Burns and other players in the international realm, Arab countries, Qatar, etc., trying to work out a ceasefire deal, and there is none in sight. Not only this, but you have Josep Borrell, our favorite person in the European Union. He, the EU so-called foreign policy chief, he has come out publicly and said Netanyahu just doesn't listen anyway, so he's not really going to listen. So, Scott, your reaction to all the latest updates in Gaza and the larger Middle East situation that is being, of course, fueled by the U.S. and Israel.
Well, I mean, wow, where to start on this one? Do we start with a 4-year-old girl on a telephone to the Palestinian 911, saying that she's in a car? They'd already listened to her 15-year-old cousin phone in live and be murdered by the Israelis. You hear the machine gun fire, you hear the bullets hitting her body, and she's dead. So now this 4-year-old girl calls in and she says, somebody come and save me. Somebody come and save me." And then they send 2 paramedics. They coordinated with the Israelis and said, "We're sending 2 paramedics." The Israelis said, "Okay." They did everything the Israelis asked them to do. And when the paramedics arrived on the scene, they were then killed by the Israelis. Their vehicle run over, set on fire, the body's burned, and the 4-year-old girl is dead. Is this where we begin, where the Israelis are using 4-year-old children as live bait to lure in paramedics to murder them? It's not unique. The Israelis do this over and over again. How about the doctor who's in surgery and the Israeli sniper shoots him while he's in surgery? How about the people trying to arrive at a hospital for medical care that are shot? The mother taking her child across the road, shot, the child wounded. This happens on a daily basis. This is literal genocide being carried out by the Israelis. It's murder of the most egregious form. And and then what we talk about, Patrick Mahomes. Look, I watched the Super Bowl. I'm not a hypocrite. I mean, I watched it. I wanted to watch it. I've been waiting for this sporting event. But I also understood that, while that was happening, what was going on in Rafah, was it done deliberately? I think so. I think the Israelis timed it so that America is distracted, so that the news cycle couldn't be generated. Because what they did was horrible. The Israelis have been dropping leaflets on the civilian population in Gaza, telling them to go to Rafah. That's where they'll be safe. So about 1.6 million of the Palestinians did go to Rafah. They're crammed in there. And now the Israelis start to take down the hospitals, attack the schools. And last night they bombed a mosque, and they killed hundreds of people. I mean, they ripped their bodies apart. We're talking about women, children, civilians. They dropped the bomb. They claim it was in support of an anti-terrorist operation that rescued 2 Israeli hostages. Well, let me put it this way. Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 are the 2 American preeminent hostage rescue forces in the military. Then there's the FBI's hostage rescue team. If they ran an operation where if they to rescue 2 hostages, they had to kill nearly 150 people, wound another 250 people, and kill 3 hostages, maybe 8 hostages total. There's 5 that are wounded. No one would call that a success. In fact, if you put those parameters out there, if you brief those parameters saying, Mr. President, we're going to launch a raid. When it's done, we'll have murdered 150 civilians, 200 wounded. We'll get 2 hostages back, but 3 are going to die and 5 more are going to be wounded, probably dead. The president would say, you're not doing the operation. It isn't going to happen. That's a failure. The Israelis are calling this a success. It's not a success. It's murder, mass murder. The Israelis are getting away with it. Nobody's stopping them. Nobody, not the United States. The United States is the only nation that could stop them. We're not. The Egyptians, I mean, they're talking tough. We're going to rip up the Camp David Accords. We're moving 40 tanks to the border. We're moving some air defense to the border. But you really think Egypt's going to throw away the golden egg that's been laid to him by Camp David, the deal where their military aid and their aid from the United States is directly linked to the aid that the United States gives to Israel. So Egypt isn't going to encourage the United States to stop giving aid to Israel because that affects their money. Egypt isn't going to rip up the Camp David Accords because that affects their money. That's their wealth. Egypt has never cared about the Palestinian people. One of the reasons why life in Gaza sucks so bad is that Egypt has been colluding with Israel to seal it off. And suddenly the world's saying it's up to Egypt to save the day. Egypt's not going to save the day. No one cares about the Palestinian people. The Jordanians don't. Hell, the king of Jordan was in the White House the other day, Super Bowl Sunday, and didn't, I was waiting for the what's that movie, Love Actually, the big Christmas movie where Hugh Grant's the British prime minister, and he has this scene where he's doing a press conference with the American president, and he just tells him off. You're not a friend. Boom, boom. I keep waiting for the Love Actually moment for somebody, some world leader of stature to sit there with Tony Blinken or the president or some American official and say, no, you suck. No, we're not doing this anymore. We're done. You're bad. You're not a friend. This isn't how it's going to operate. But nobody ever does it because that's Hollywood. That's fantasy. That's where people actually have a moral, that have a spine and moral courage. There's no moral leader out there right now. Saudi Arabia is making noises, but they're not going to do anything. Turkey's making noises, but they're not going to do anything. Iran, they're not going to do anything. Hezbollah, they're not going to do anything. I think the Palestinian people, the only hope they have is Hamas. Hamas continuing to resist. And by doing so and by exposing the criminal nature of Israel to create a reaction, to continue this reaction around the world, because the United States is never going to do the right thing in Palestine because of the Palestinian people. We don't care about them. We just proved it. Super Bowl Sunday. We were silent while 150 women and children were blown into tiny little pieces by the Israelis. We were silent. We didn't do anything. But we do care about the global South turning their back on us. This is what hurts. This is where American ambassadors are writing in saying, hey, we're losing the world. In October, we have the BRICS forum meeting in Kazan in Russia under Russian leadership. And BRICS is going to start becoming, first of all, they doubled in size from 5 to 10. The 10 new members are going to be there. They're going to talk about increasing their expansion, but they're going to start creating institutions that replicate what the G7 does, what the G20 does, institutions that allow now for foreign policy and economic policy to be coordinated amongst the BRICS members. BRICS is the global South. And so as Russia starts attracting the global South is taking a look at the United States saying, we don't want to have any part of this anymore. You guys are horrible, what you did here. That could be the impetus for the United States to do the right thing and stop Israel. Look, as long as we allow Benjamin Netanyahu to stay in power, and remember, we allow this to happen. We could terminate him today, right now. The president could pick up the phone and say, Bibi, you're done. You can't get rid of him, a sovereign state. Well, you ain't sovereign enough because we will stop all the money. We will pull the plug on every deal we have. We will force AIPAC to register as a foreign agent. We will do a whole bunch of stuff that you don't want us to do, that none of your colleagues want us to do if you don't step down. We can make him step down today, right now, but we don't because we don't have the guts. We don't have the cojones to do that. but we might once the global South says we're done. And BRICS is the leverage. BRICS is the leverage. So if Hamas can continue to hold out, continue to deny Israel military victory, and by resisting, and by the world seeing the crimes of Israel against the Palestinian people become even more politically relevant. Look, the Biden doctrine. I don't know. Did you read the Tom Friedman piece in the New York Times about the new Biden doctrine?
Oh no.
It talks about a new Palestinian state. We really have to fight for it. Yeah, but Tom, what you used an interesting word, demilitarized. How can you talk about a sovereign Palestinian state that's demilitarized? So what does demilitarized mean? It means that Hamas, who has won this great victory by withstanding the Israeli onslaught, has to step aside. That isn't going to happen. So I don't think it's all over for the Palestinians, but I'm telling you right now, anybody who thinks that the Egyptians are going to be the cavalry, that the Jordanians are going to be the cavalry, that Saudi Arabia is going to do the right thing, you're waiting in vain. This is Hamas's fight. Maybe Hezbollah will step up to the plate. I don't know. They promised, but remember, Hezbollah is a political party now, not just a resistance militia. It's a political party that has to take care of Lebanon. And I think, Nasrallah understands that, while on the ground, Hezbollah can fight the Israelis to a standstill, even take the initiative, maybe seize the Galilee, that Israel will blow the living hell out of Beirut, blow the living hell out of Lebanon. And that creates a dangerous situation for Hezbollah, because right now Hezbollah is a party that has a reputation of being good at governance, meaning that they care for all of Lebanon. And if they get involved in a war with Israel that causes Lebanon, who right now is in a precarious economic condition, political condition, to be destroyed, then that puts the future of Hezbollah at risk. Everybody looks out for their own best interests. Nobody's willing to sacrifice themselves for the Palestinian people. So at the end of the day, the only hope Palestine has is the continued resilience of its population and the ability of Hamas to hold out.
Yeah, I think it's a good point too, what you brought up, Scott, about the varying reasons for inaction regionally. We've talked about on this program, of course, Ansar Allah, the Houthis, their heroic stand, which continues, although it's not front page news anymore. But that blockade continues. It's what they can do, and I think you bring up a good point about the axis of resistance. I mean, you're talking about a powder keg. Israel is not a stranger to potentially invading and bombing and laying waste to large segments of Lebanon. Syria knows what it's like to be under fire from Israel, because it is almost every other day in some capacity. Iran also understands its role and its position and what it means to be the top dog in that region for the United States and the West to eventually get to. We saw that earlier when you were on the program, and we talked about the potential for war with Iran. There are influential segments of the U.S. political class that truly do want that. So it is a powder keg for the axis of resistance side. And then, with the other side, the maybe more compliant Arab countries or regional countries, I think this was underestimated maybe at the beginning. I think many people thought the situation is so dire. So, yeah, of course, Saudi Arabia and Jordan, they will take a stronger stance. But at the same time, many of these countries have been so deeply connected to, especially the United States, not to mention growing ties with Israel, but especially the U.S.'s influence that remains, even if there's BRICS and all these great developments. It doesn't mean that something as sensitive as the Palestine question, something that is so monumental, would change the entire region. What happens there will change the entire region. So Saudi Arabia, Jordan, these countries, their leadership, they feel like that would be political suicide for them. What are the consequences? They're not thinking about the Palestinians. They're thinking about themselves. And so I think, you bring up a really great point there, but I'll kick it back to you if you have anything that you want to add to the situation for Gaza and Palestine.
Well, I don't want to say that the axis of resistance is feckless because clearly they're not. We see Hezbollah engaged in a in a in putting continuous pressure, escalation of pressure on Israel along its border. Um, and Hezbollah has taken some losses, and they've inflicted serious losses on the Israelis. But again, I think to step into war, this an existential conflict is a huge step, and it. I'm not saying it's impossible for Hezbollah to do that, but I'm saying that um, Hezbollah will not gladly go in that direction. Neither will Iran. Remember, Iran just normalized relations with Saudi Arabia. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran are now members of BRICS. Iran is pivoting its economy for the first time in many decades. They've been able to get their economy positioned to overcome the strains put on it by U.S. led sanctions, Western sanctions. And so, for the Iranian people who've been promised this moment for decades, now it's time for Iran to flourish and to thrive and for them to have this economic, you know, well-being that has been promised, for Iran to throw it all away. Because while the United States won't be able to defeat Iran, we can seriously blow up a lot of Iranian infrastructure, and we can set Iran back economically. And that creates the potential for domestic unrest. Every regime has to look out for its own best interests. And while the Iranians aren't going to be defeated by an American flotilla or American army, um, there is the possibility that unrest can happen from within. Now, people who study Iran, I'm one of them. I tend to believe that there's a lot more resilience in the theocracy than the West gives it credit for, but it's still a gamble, and it's one that Iran doesn't want to take. The people have been promised a better life, and so Iran will hesitate before throwing the dice down on the table and engaging decisively with Israel and the United States in a manner that will, trigger a response, a military response, which, while it won't defeat Iran, will hurt Iran. So I think there's a lot of hesitancy out there right now. The Houthi are about the only ones who basically said, "We don't
Nothing to
care.
lose. Nothing to
We've been
lose. Yeah.
doing this. We've been doing this since 2014. We don't care. We're doing the right thing here." But
Right.
the Houthi, they have limitations about what they can achieve.
Yeah.
And they will need Iranian support. If they're to escalate, Iran will have to provide them, newer generation of weaponry, etc. I'm just basically, again, it comes down to the pressure that can be put. There will not be a ceasefire as long as Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister. I firmly believe that, because he's equated a ceasefire with Israeli defeat. So as long as Netanyahu holds on to power, you're going to be seeing a continued escalation of military power. But even he understands that to trigger a conflict with Hezbollah would be not only devastating for Lebanon but also for Israel, and that he would pay the price. So I think this selfish self-interest, which is the prerogative of every sovereign state, is the one thing that's going to prevent this thing from exploding out of control. Um, the What Netanyahu is hoping for is that the Palestinian people crack before the international support for Palestine becomes so great that the United States compels him to step aside. So we're in that kind of race. It's very risky. I mean, it's literally like they've emptied out powder kegs, and you got a bunch of books and matches there, and a bunch of arson
Yeah.
inclined kids, flicking matches around. Match connects with the gunpowder, it's going up. But I do believe that there's enough adults in the room that understand the consequences of that, and they'll manage this escalation so it doesn't get to that route. The tragedy is 4-year-old Palestinian girls are going to be getting on the phone, calling in for help, and help is never going to arrive because the Israelis are murderous sons of bitches who are committing the most horrific war crimes imaginable, and nobody in the world cares.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine also the decisions that you're talking about being made that we have no where we can't be a party to, right? The decision for Iran or Hezbollah, these countries which have there's a massive popular sentiment, not just worldwide, but it's been like this in the region for quite some time. A massive popular sentiment in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and with something like this going on, this literal genocide, to have to walk the line, toe the line, do only what is possible, but may not change the calculus of what's going on. I mean, I can't imagine what it must be like to be in that situation. And at the same time, I think you're right. It's so interesting. It feels like the axis of resistance has been the force that has been preventing the powder keg from exploding, while Israel, of course, the United States, have been lighting all the matches everywhere. And so it's been very interesting to watch that. And now, and maybe last question on this. Now you have William Burns there, and Scott, you know intelligence. He's there, of course. He's known also as sort of a more of a diplomatic character when it comes to intelligence operatives, leaders. Could you talk about what possibly he could be saying, talking about, raising here, given the fact that all the reports are saying, yes, exactly what you're saying, Scott. Netanyahu, Israel, there's no progress there. Hamas, there's lots of progress. They were willing, as long as certain terms were met that are very meetable, very achievable. Like, for example, the cessation and withdrawal of hostile military forces in Gaza. That seems to be achievable. There's no gain here. So William Burns has been there for I believe it's been over a day at least. Um, what do you think he's saying? What do you think is going on there in terms of from the intelligence perspective?
Well, he was brought in as the director of CIA not because of his extensive intelligence background. He doesn't have one. He's a diplomat. He was a very successful ambassador to Russia. Um, he's the man who wrote the 2008 Niet means Niet memorandum, no means no, about the dangers of inviting Ukraine into NATO, the inevitability of conflict with Russia that would produce. Um, he has a reputation. They call him, the master of the back channel. In fact, he wrote a book called The Back Channel, which is sort of his autobiography about the role that he played in doing these kind of back channel deals. And so he was brought in because the CIA in the Middle East has a role that goes beyond simple espionage or intelligence work. Especially with the Israelis and the Palestinians, the CIA became the trusted broker between the two. Where a CIA officer could meet with the PLO, meet with Fatah, and then go and meet with Amman, meet with Mossad, and get the security services to work with one another. The CIA actually built up a reputation and a body, a man pool, a pool of manpower that had this experience. And so I think that's the role that he's playing right now. His job right now is to get the security services, because security services at the end of the day, they always talk to each other, no matter what. I mean, I was laughing. I was not laughing. Yeah, I was laughing about the Battle of Mariupol. I was speaking to Adam Dylan the Chechen commander of the Chechen forces in Mariupol, and he talked about how he was in open radio contact with Budanov, the head of the Ukrainian military and intelligence, that they would coordinate with each other and talk to each other. And he said, Budanov's actually a pretty smart guy, a pretty capable guy, but you couldn't imagine this, but it happened. The intelligence people, the security people are always talking to each other because that's their job. And so I think Burns is there, trying to work the back channel, trying to, come up with a solution that's, we're not going to read about it, because the purpose of the back channel isn't to make headlines. The purpose of the back channel is to quietly go in there and get the ball rolling, get people talking, get things happening. Can he succeed? It's a big problem, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if Netanyahu stays in power. Then there's no chance for for a ceasefire, and the only way you're going to bring a peaceful conclusion to this is through a ceasefire. So what kind of deals can Burns cut? What kind of assurances can he give? At the end of the day, he's going to be limited by Israel, by Netanyahu, and so we'll have to see. I think everybody that he's talking to could make the kind of compromises necessary to get a ceasefire, a lasting ceasefire in place, by punting down the road some of the more difficult issues, like what's the final status of Hamas politically, what's the final status of Hamas militarily. These are two, so-called game. The game doesn't go on if they're still there, but you can't make them go away when they're winning on the ground, when they're defeating the Israeli military, and when the Hamas is more popular politically than they've ever been. So I think Burns's job is to go in there and create carve-outs and say, okay, this is an issue that will push down the road. This is another issue we'll push down the road. But what we need to do is get enough concurrence on issues we can agree upon so we can get a ceasefire, get the hostages exchanged for prisoners, and get humanitarian aid in, and bring the temperature down, tremendously on this problem. And then once we do that, we shift it away from the battlefield to, how do we deal now with these cutouts that have been identified, and then he can step aside and let the diplomats take over. But I think that's his job. His job right now is to shape the political battlefield so that there can be a ceasefire as soon as possible.
Well, Scott, I kept you a while, and I want to be respectful of your time. And so perhaps we can close now. One last thing, a Patreon member, if you could just maybe in a minute or less, or I know on U.S. Tour of Duty on your program, Ask the Inspector, you do very short answers to viewer questions. Yes, I have a Patreon member question from Fahim. And so, folks, if you want to subscribe on Patreon, you can submit questions, guest suggestions, etc. Find that link in the video description. But the question is, and I know you like this question, so it might be hard to answer in just a minute or two, but do you think that Putin went over history so extensively because he knows that Americans' versions of history is what happened just an hour ago, and it's important for Americans to understand the historical context? Do you feel like that was an underlying motivation for his focus on history, especially in the beginning?
Well, again, I'm loath to speak on behalf of the Russian president and presume that I know why he did, and etc. But what I will say is this: is somebody who's studied the Russian president, every word he speaks is important, whether he's swearing or whether he's talking history. He is very careful in what he says, and he understands that words have meaning, and when a president of Russia says words, that people are listening, and he's careful not to put himself in a situation where he overcommits verbally, or he understates. Everything is precise. It's done for a reason. And so there's a reason why he did that. And the reasons don't have to be, the thing about Vladimir Putin is he's a man capable of complex thoughts. So the reason doesn't just have to be to throw Tucker Carlson off. I mean, that's a desired outcome, but the substance of the words still matter. And so he was committing to a historic narrative that he wanted not just America, but the world, and to, frankly speaking, the Russian people to hear. He's also speaking to the Russian people. Every time he speaks, he's speaking to the Russian people. He treats them with that kind of respect. And so he's putting forward a narrative saying, this is the vision that I, the leader of the Russian nation, have from a historic standpoint. I'm committing to this narrative, and, people need to be aware of that. So I think also the Russian people, and I probably shouldn't read your chat, but I know you have some Russians in your chat right now, and we'll see if they agree with me or not. But the Russian people know Russian history, so they're able to read into the lesson that Putin is giving. They're going, oh, he's talking about left bank, right bank. He's talking about Ukraine, Russia, new Russia, and all that stuff. And the Russian people are going, okay, we get it, we understand, because he hasn't been articulating a an in-game strategy. I saw that when I was over there. People kept saying, "How's it going to end?" I said, "Don't ask me. Ask the Russian government. The Russian government's the only one that can articulate, how this thing ends." That's a question that goes to the Russian government. The fact that you don't know the answer means the Russian government hasn't adequately communicated that to you. So I think what Vladimir Putin was doing was laying the foundation for this larger discussion of, how this war will end, what an end game looks like. So I think every word he spoke during this this interview with Tucker Carlson carried weight, and I think it was spoken for a reason. Again, you can address different audiences. Like I said, I think he was addressing an American audience. That was addressing a European audience. He's addressing a Russian audience. Every word mattered, and that's hopefully another takeaway that people will have is you don't have to love Vladimir Putin. You don't have to run around with a Team Putin t-shirt or any of that kind of stuff, but respect the guy. And, respect the fact that he believes in what he's doing, that his belief is founded in fact, and respect, how he defines himself. There's a lot of people out there trying to define Russia. Well, that's fine and dandy. He spoke of the Russian soul. And my challenge to every American listening, everybody in the world, is why don't you go on a journey of trying to define what the Russian soul is? And if you do that, you might actually begin to understand the Russian perspective. John F. Kennedy gave a speech at American University in June of 1963. It's a famous speech. And one of the things that he said in the speech is that, we're in the Cold War, we had just gone through the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he said, it's imperative. We don't have to embrace what the Soviets are saying. We don't have to agree with what they're doing, but we do have to put ourselves in their shoes so we understand where they're coming from, what their perspective is. We have to respect that. I think Vladimir Putin basically, through this presentation, put down a giant pair of moccasins and said, jump on in, guys. Feel what it's like to be a Russian. Try to understand us. Try to understand our perspective. And anybody who takes the time and effort to do that, I think will be better positioned to understand what the best way forward is for the United States and Russia in terms of resolving the many issues that confront us today.
Yeah, indeed. And I forgot to mention this. I'll just mention it briefly. From earlier, the way and when he was speaking to an American audience, I felt like every time he said something like, "Oh, Tucker, the time you applied for the CIA. Oh, who blew up Nord Stream? You
You
did.
did.
Oh, who what's my response to China being the new colonizer? Oh, that's a boogeyman story. You're hurting yourself." He wasn't saying Tucker Carlson, although I think Tucker Carlson at times, like with the Nord Stream situation, took it like a champ and made good humor out of it. But I think what Putin was doing was saying, no, you, as in Americans, the U.S., making this connection because, I think we have a situation where many Americans, whether they are doing this intentionally or maybe they're not thinking about it, they do identify with the U.S. government's actions. They don't agree with everything. They certainly don't even pay attention to everything. They don't think everything matters. But at the same time, done in the name of Americans, the United people in the United States. So I thought that was also just brilliant to do, like, you, not the U.S. government, because if he had done that, then you take out then you shift the audience. Then he's talking to the U.S. government, and also and not to mention that is provocative too. That would be considered, a slander, an attack, and then you'd have the mainstream media being able to go, with report after report after report about how Putin spoke like this and made threats. You see it now with the whole NATO Trump comments, right? Trump said this thing about NATO that he's literally been saying like every single day of his political career since the 2016 campaign. But now it's this huge thing because he said it, and he said Russia can do whatever it wants, right? So anything. So they were looking for that, and he didn't give them any ammunition at all. They couldn't even put words in his mouth, but yet he still spoke to Americans. So I thought that was,
Yeah.
I don't know, pretty
I thought
incredible.
one of the underappreciated parts of his presentation too was the lecture he gave us on dollar policy and how America's committing economic suicide with that. I hope that every American listened to that and understand that
Right.
this guy's 100% correct, that we slit our own throat. De-dollarization could not have occurred. I'm just being frank. The power of the dollar was absolute, and de-dollarization would never occurred unless we created the conditions by delegitimizing this American control over the global economy. Why would anybody want to use the dollar as the reserve currency when the United States at any time can seize, say, $300 billion of your
Which they're still
sovereign wealth
talking
fund?
about. They're talking about
Yeah.
now. They're still talking about
So now
continue.
I'm Vietnam, and I've got my money, and I go, wow, wait a minute. So you're telling me that if I ever do anything that the United States Congress isn't happy about, you can just seize my money in your system? I don't like that. Hey, BRICS, you going to come up with an alternative? Yeah, we think we will. I'm going that way. Here's your dollars back. We don't want them anymore. I mean, and this is what we've done. And Putin, you can see the exasperation in his face because he's sitting there going, "Why are you doing
He's
this?
like,
This really makes
yeah,
no sense." you know?
right. The eyes, you can see it. It's just like, what sense does this make? It's only going to hurt the United States. And he outlined very clearly, just in terms of Russian trade, Russia-China trade, as just one example, because this is just happening all across the board, whether we're talking about China, UAE, or any other instance, especially amongst global South countries, the BRICS countries, the rising emerging economies in the global South, that they are all making moves toward currency swaps, bilateral trade being transitioned into their national currencies. Like that's the
things
trend,
that
and
are
you're exactly
things that
right.
are economically inefficient. I mean, they're losing money doing this. The
Right?
dollar was
Exactly.
very convenient. And the other thing is, yeah, I just don't understand the United States Senate. I mean, I really don't. But we made so much money off of having the dollar as the convenience to the United States of the dollar being the global currency of choice. Was a tremendous multi-$100 billion plus, economic advantage, and we've thrown it away. It's literally like we said, how can we guarantee the collapse of the American economy in the shortest time frame possible? Why don't we do everything we can to get the world to turn their back on the US dollar? And we did it. And so, I mean, this is insane. And the rest of the world, nobody would have said, "I'm willing to take the hit." The cost of currency transactions, the inefficiency of this design, currency swaps, etc. The only reason they're doing that is because the United States has made it impossible for them to continue to be involved with the dollar. The United States Senate, really, if you guys want to do something good for, you know, whatever happens to you in the election, pass a law that says the United States that you're not going to ever sanction people again. Sanctions are stupid. Pass a law that preserves the integrity of the dollar being the global reserve currency of choice. Create a system that protects people who use the dollar, and then and only then we might be able to get some people to say, like in BRICS. I mean, it would be nice if you did that before October, so that people in BRICS going, "Hey, wait a minute, stop! Before we talk about taking this big step of dumping the dollar, America just did something smart. They're making the dollar attractive again. Um, can we get it in writing, America? Can BRICS now turn to America and say, get it in writing? No more denial of SWIFT system, no more, things like that. And if they do that, I think a lot of people, even the Saudis, will say, all right, yeah, we'll go back to the dollar as the petro currency, because we know how that works. We know that it can work. We know how efficient it can be. but they can't do it if America is going to use that. Marco Rubio, who I despise, had a moment of honesty a while back when he was talking about Brazil, and Brazil was talking about de-dollarization. They're talking about doing transactions in other currencies. He said we can't allow this to happen. He said because if Brazil dumps the dollar, then we won't be able to control the Brazilian economy through sanctions. I'm like, that's the whole idea, Marco. And the fact that you want to control the Brazilian economy through sanctions is the greatest reason the Brazilians could ever have to dump the dollar. Whereas if you said, our job isn't to control your economy through sanctions, our job is to ensure that the dollar is a stable currency for global commerce, that's our number one driving economic factor, to keep the dollar as the most stable, viable currency for, international commerce. But that's not the goal. We have to control the world. And as a result, we're going to lose the mechanism that gives us that control, the US dollar.
Yeah. Yeah. And it comes out of, I mean, it not only is it a losing venture or losing policy, but it comes out of desperation because it's obviously coming out of a need to control Brazil's economy. Sure. Yes. These are how these people think. And at the same time, the reality is, at least, what isn't just abstract, is that this is directed toward very particular countries that the United States wants, obviously, to control, and they can't do it. And so it's gone to the point where they've turned to every, if there's a toolbox, they've opened up the whole tool, they've poured all the tools out, and they said, all right, let's throw the wrench at Russia. And that you don't throw wrenches, that's the thing, is that they're throwing everything they can at countries that are rising, that they can't control, and it's backfiring big time, because this was never going to end well if it means that you have to sacrifice economic stability or even economic influence for that very goal. Because the very goal of controlling a country like Russia, China, getting them to fall, destabilize them, weaken them, that's exactly what you're trying to do. So it's an interesting dynamic that I think is going to continue to play out on the world stage for some time to come. And I'm glad, Scott, that you are willing to spend your time with me to go over these things. So appreciate your time. I think it's time to close up, though. We've been here for a couple hours. So, Scott, I have your scottritterextra.com in the video description. Do you want any parting words before we head out of here on what people can expect? I know that you have an interview out. Maybe you can talk about some of those things, and then we'll head out of here.
Yeah, when I was in Russia, I had an opportunity to interview Alexander Khodakovsky, the commander of the Vostok battalion. It's more like the Vostok Brigade, but this is, he's a former commander of Ukrainian Alpha Group, forces. And after Maidan, he and many of his soldiers basically said they don't support the ultranationalists, and they went to the Donbass and took up arms against the Ukrainian government. He's been fighting this fight since 2014. One of the most experienced commanders out there. When I was preparing for the interview, because I did prepare, I was ready to have a conversation about drones and about artillery and about the modern, face of war, etc. We ended up having a very philosophical discussion about U.S.-Russian relations, and it's one of the more interesting interviews I've ever done. It was more like a conversation.
Right.
And so I would encourage people, if you go on my Substack, I published a short article that introduces that interview, and then you can watch the interview. We've put it out on Rumble and YouTube, but I think people would find that interview very interesting. And I continue. I wrote an article before I went to Russia on my Substack, Sympathy for the Devil Part 1. And when I basically introduced the concept of, good versus evil in the world today and how it influences individual decisions and the decisions of government. Part 2 is hopefully coming out on Friday. And I think I don't want to give away too much, but let's just say that the the face of evil looks an awful like Benjamin Netanyahu, the face of the devil. So we'll see what happens. So yeah, that to look forward to. But again, everything, all interviews I do, everything I write can be found on scottritterextra.com. Oh, and
Great.
I'll give you
Yes.
one last piece of news. Roger Waters was kind enough to allow me to use his song "Two Suns in the Sunset" for my documentary film, and
Oh,
so
amazing.
we're going to be producing a trailer for the movie. We're finalizing that based upon that song, and so hopefully in the not too distant future, the movie trailer will be out, and people can watch that as well.
Well, we'll have to maybe get you and Roger on a stream or something talking about that film. ScottRitterExtra.com. You can also donate to Waging Peace, the documentary that you are referring to. Yeah, so everyone, good night. Go to the video description before you leave here. Patreon, Substack, PayPal, buy me a coffee, wherever you want to support. It's very much appreciated. Hit that like button before you go. Subscribe to the channel if you're new here. And I will return soon. Thanks again, Scott, for joining me. And I'll catch you all next time. Bye-bye.